Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. One of the most frequent questions I hear when it comes to climate change is, well, surely the plants will just eat more carbon and that will solve the problem. And actually it's a fairly reasonable question because that's what they do. But it's not that straightforward. And today we're going to be joined by Emma and Rob from the Birmingham Institute for Forest Research, where they're literally changing the atmosphere of a forest, and hopefully we'll be able to answer that question. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, we're here with Rob and Emma today from Bifor, which is part of Birmingham University, and they're doing some really interesting research into the climate and the atmosphere and how it's all going to change and is changing with CO2 and the levels of everything. So I'll let you guys explain it because you do it much more eloquently than I will be able to. So if you could just explain a bit about what you're doing here and why it's so important, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, sure. Now, so Emma and I are both part of the Institute, which covers a whole lot of things related to forests and how they can help us live sustainably. And we'll touch on various aspects, I think, through our conversation. The reason we're out in this particular forest, standing next to all this particular infrastructure, is because we have a large experimental facility here. It's the only one in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's looking at how mature, temperate, deciduous oak forest will respond to the change in atmospheric composition that's happening as a result of our using fossil fuel. So specifically what we're doing is we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. And then in this experiment, we're projecting the forest further into the future by adding more carbon dioxide into some experimental patches and seeing how the forest responds.
So is that kind of the different levels we see? Because we always talk about 1.5 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees, all this type of thing. Are you replicating those kind of situations and what will it be like if and should we reach that point?
The set point for this experiment is an additional 150 units of carbon dioxide above the current level of carbon dioxide, which is about 410 units. That takes us, in terms of the projected atmosphere of the planet, to about the middle of the 21st century on all the pathways that we've been looking at. So very sustainable pathways towards net zero, or business as usual, very high emission pathways. They're all going to go through the point that we're looking at here. If we're lucky, the sustainability pathways will begin to kick in and take us down, and we won't go much beyond the value that we're looking at here. If we're unlucky, the business as usual pathways will take us to much higher carbon futures than even the one we're looking at here. Okay,
so this is kind of the best case in a way.
Yes, scenario. It's kind of best case, but it's also a realistic case for...
Every case?
Well, it's every case in that sense that you can't avoid going through this point in the middle of the century. And we find it's relevant for policymakers and other stakeholders who are interested in what we're doing here, because we're not sort of so far out into the future that it's very much a maybe or a what if kind of experiment. It's, as Emma says, it's very much that we've got to go through this point.
And then obviously you've got your trajectory, so you know that it's potentially going to carry on going whatever way it's going.
That's right.
Going forward.
Yeah. So atmospheric composition is what we're looking at here, and we can look later at some of the technology that we use to make that happen. But of course, that change in CO2 drives a change in climate. A change in the mean climate, so global warming, and a change in the frequency of climate extremes. And so here we're looking at very much the response of semi-natural, let's say, a semi-natural environment. But the work we do in the Institute stretches right across all environments, and Emma's particularly interested in the urban environment.
Yeah, so my research is about climate change in trees, but in a very different way than what's happening here at the FACE experiment. And I think that's the important thing about Birmingham Institute of Forest Research, is that there's all kinds of different research happening here from all kinds of different disciplines from across the university and also nationally and internationally. And for me specifically, my background is in weather and climate and understanding how weather patterns are changing, then understanding how extreme weather was impacting infrastructure, and understanding how infrastructure companies such as Network Rail and Highways England can start to adapt their infrastructure to be ready for the extreme weather that we are experiencing now. So if you think of what was happening in New York a couple of weeks ago, but also in the future, and that's climate adaptation. And trees are a big part of making our infrastructure resilient for the future and making our urban areas resilient for the future. And I think it's really important that we have this kind of connection between the academic research that's saying that we need more trees, we need trees to be resilient, but also between the kind of practitioner world where practitioners are getting trees into the ground and making sure that there isn't a disconnect between academia and practice. And through that, I do a lot of work with the Trees and Design Action Group, who are a network of built environment practitioners and academics all working to make our urban areas greener.
Yeah, and that's how we met originally and
how we met.
Ended up here. And there's some amazing work going on there because there's so many, I've seen quite a few solutions because this is more my world really, is the built environment side. I've seen a lot of ideas and projects being done in various places around the world where it's already not so much extreme weather, but it's very hot, for example, is a place where it's much more common. And I've been in Mallorca, and they've got all the cycle lanes are tree lined and clipped, so you can go under trees the whole way. And it's there's a lot of small things like that being done in a lot of other countries to make things more comfortable and more accessible. But now we're seeing the real extreme weather events, like the flooding, like you just mentioned, and more prolonged heat waves and all that type of thing. There's a lot more issues that are kind of developing that we haven't experienced before, aren't there? And it's how we think about using trees to mitigate as much of that as possible.
That's right. It's about integrating trees and green infrastructure and putting them on equal footing with our grey infrastructure assets within the urban environment, because unlike grey infrastructure assets, trees only increase in value as they get older. So if you want to have a more valuable urban area for the future, then you should be putting trees in it, and you should be making sure that you retain those trees that we have, because why chop a mature tree down when you can retain it and all the benefits that it's providing us and nature.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So I had a question for you, Rob.
Go ahead.
Which is around, it's a bit of a generic question, but it's one you always see cropping up on social media.
Sure.
And I think it's quite an interesting one to try and answer. And I don't know if you might want to answer it later after you explained a bit more first, but it's around...
I can have several goes and see which one actually sticks. What's the question?
Yeah, feel free. So the question basically is, because trees and plants take in carbon, I've seen a lot of people sort of saying, well, actually, they're just taking more carbon if there's more of it. It's like giving them more food. So we're going to see trees grow much bigger, much quicker, and actually it will kind of level out. Now, obviously, we've lost a lot of our forests. We've lost a lot of the capacity to do that. And the oceans actually absorb a lot more carbon anyway. But trees obviously still have a huge role to play. So I was just wondering, maybe it's a bit early to talk about it and you want to lead into it later. But I think it's quite an interesting question to sort of frame the discussion.
No, I think now is a good time, because actually it is often a place where I start when I'm showing visitors around here, for instance, or starting a lecture, whether it's an undergraduate lecture or a lecture to professionals. So trees provide this enormous free gift in terms of carbon. So in terms of the global budget, you can think about all the CO2, extra CO2 that's coming into the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning and from land use change. And that's in about a ratio of about 9:1. So if we think of 10 units coming into the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning and land use change, less than half of it stays in the atmosphere. It's that amount in the atmosphere that, of course, then drives the climate change that Emma was talking about. About a quarter of it is dissolved into the top of the ocean, as you've just said, and what's left goes into the land, mostly into forests. So forests are already providing this enormous free gift to us in terms of soaking up extra carbon that we're putting into the system. But whether that can continue depends very much on the forests functioning well. So being healthy is perhaps one way of thinking about it. And for a forest to be healthy, it needs not just carbon. It needs a ready supply of water. It needs the temperature to be right. It needs particularly its nutrients also to be available, nitrogen and phosphorus particularly. So just like we need a healthy balanced diet, plants need a healthy balanced diet, and forests, the community of plants and animals in a forest, need to be in balance. So there's kind of levels there of healthiness and balance that we need to think about, which we haven't been good at thinking about in the past. We're beginning this and other experiments, and you've been to other forests, research forests, where they've been looking at aspects of that individual plant response, but also the community response.
Yeah, so the project I've looked at previously was at Harvard University, and they were sort of looking more at the temperature of the soil, if I remember correctly, and it was how the microbial content of the soil is changing. And they were finding that as the temperatures got warmer, so this wasn't so much CO2 related in terms of that causing the issue, it was more global temperature.
Yep.
But they were finding that soils were starting to emit carbon as it got warmer, which is obviously another huge issue, because soils are a huge store of carbon as well. Yep. And that's all because the microbial makeup is sort of changing, and some species are becoming more active and some are becoming less active, and all of this type of thing.
Yeah, very much the same kind of story happening here. There's a whole load of action happening below ground, even in a forest like this, which seems to be so dominated by the above ground elements, 25-meter tall oak trees. Just watching the birds flying past. A lot is happening below ground. What we're finding is that we're offering about 40% more carbon dioxide. That's what that 150 units of extra carbon dioxide equates to. So a 40% step up in carbon dioxide all day through the growing season in our experimental patches. On average, we're finding 20%, so about a fifth as much more photosynthesis happening in those experimental patches. So more carbon is coming into the system. But we're also measuring what you were talking about that from Harvard Forest. We're measuring the respiration of everything that's alive in the forest, particularly what's alive in the ground, including the plant roots, but also all the microbes and in fact insects too. And we're seeing more coming out of the forest through respiration. So we're seeing an increasing speed of carbon in and carbon out. We're not entirely sure what the budget is.
That was going to be my question.
But the indication, it's not impossible to think about a situation where what you do is you actually kind of catalyze a runaway process in the soil. If that's true, that would be a very big result, and it would be very bad news for us. What we're hoping we are actually seeing is more carbon coming in than is being released.
Yeah.
And that difference is a store of carbon in the forest.
Mm-hmm.
How long the forest will store that carbon is another question which perhaps we should go on to later on.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about that kind of process, because people probably don't necessarily realise that because you just think about trees taking carbon in, don't you? You don't really think about them releasing it, and the same with the soil in a way. But actually, as you described prior to us starting filming, they kind of breathe in and breathe out as much we do. So actually, we breathe in oxygen, we take some of it, but we still breathe some out. Trees very much do the same thing. So there's this transfer where they take a bit of it in, but they're still releasing some.
It's always a net. It's always about the net, the net change between photosynthesis and respiration. Everything that's alive, everything that's alive respires. You can use other substrates, but the vast majority of what's alive turns sugar back into carbon dioxide and water. So the inverse of photosynthesis. And so the plants are doing that just the same as we are. And it's always about that balance. The reason we're doing our experiment in a research forest is because, whereas in the lab, we can get a measurement of an individual leaf under elevated carbon dioxide, or even a small tree. What we're really interested in is how the whole community of plants and microbes and animals respond to the elevated carbon dioxide, because it's that difference in the end that matters.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely.
And you've seen all the kit out, all the different things being measured, measuring trees, measuring soil, measuring deep inside the soil.
insects?
measuring the atmosphere, insects. Yeah, what do they call those things that collect?
Well, various traps of
Yep.
one kind or another, we have started to see some knock-on effects into the food web because the leaf chemistry is changing. So the larvae that live in the leaves, so the kind of things that gives rise to those blotches and lines that you see in a leaf that's being eaten by typically a moth larvae or a fly larvae. It seems that in the experimental patches, the leaves are actually less of the leaf is being eaten. We're still trying to work out exactly why that is, but it seems like it might be because the plant has got more resources to allocate to defense.
That's interesting, especially if you were facing so many issues with pests and diseases in the tree world. So that's quite an important finding if that's true.
Yeah, if we can get to the point where we've robustly demonstrated that, then I think that's a good news story. It doesn't mean that pests and pathogens are a question of the past, and in fact they're a very, very significant issue for us. But it could have implications for those different settings, like parkland settings and urban settings. Of course, urban settings are high CO2 settings or environments as well. It's just that we can't use them as an experimental setup because there's lots of other things changing as well.
I was just thinking about CO2 as we walked around here, Rob, carbon dioxide, and I was wondering how much does it vary? Because we get this number that, I mean, is it 400 parts per million that we're at now in the planet?
A bit more than that, yeah.
How does that vary over land, over sea, over city? Is it more or less consistent, or is it?
No, you get very, very big domes. They talk about domes of CO2, which you can see from satellite over cities, because that's where the fossil fuel burning is happening. In the plume, of course, of something like a smelter or a power station, you're going to get very, very high values. You get hemispheric changes. So there's a slow sort of wave, which is, if you look at the classic CO2 trace.
It's seasonal, isn't it?
You see in the northern hemisphere, you see that seasonal trace. So it's highest at the end of winter and lowest at the end of summer, because the whole hemisphere, northern hemisphere, these plants have been drawing down CO2 throughout the length of the growing season. So the lowest point is at the end of the northern hemisphere summer, then it comes back up again. And of course that wave pattern varies a little bit if you've got a very strong disturbance to the weather. People will probably have heard about El Nino and those kind of disturbances. That can make a difference too.
Okay.
I think it just shows how everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
And that's why carbon dioxide for trees can't just be a good thing, because it comes with all these other knock-on effects that you wouldn't even begin to think about.
Yeah, definitely. It's very, very complicated. So what's the impact you're seeing on the food web then? Is it just things a bit to do with leaves, or are there any other things you?
That's the strongest thing. Yeah,
well?
no, that's the one kind of categorical result that we've seen that's kind of popped out as a statistically significant change. Other things we're not. There's so much variability in a semi-natural environment like this that the signal isn't quite popping out. We're seeing changes below ground in terms of the community of living things, but things that are a little less charismatic than bugs. So we're seeing an increase in the mass of microbes per gram of soil below ground. So that's telling us that the system, the community, is part of the thing that's happening here is that carbon coming in at the top of the dominant plants in the leaves is being used throughout the plants, but also exported through the root system into the soil. And the reason that plants do that is because if they can afford it, if they give away some carbon in the form of sugar and amino acids, that stimulates particularly fungi to provide nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients, back to them. And the plants can't get those nutrients any other way. So it's a symbiosis, a communal response, and surprisingly strong response actually for a forest like this, which is 175 years old just in terms of its oak trees. It's older than that in terms of how long it's been a forest. And one of the questions we had right at the very beginning was, is this forest going to care at all?
Yeah.
It turns out it does care. It is agile enough. So as a set of middle-aged oak trees, I'd say they're a good deal more agile than I am as a middle-aged man in seeing that step change in CO2 and responding to it.
It's incredible. What's that in 5 years worth of data?
Yeah, so this program's been going 5 years, so as you say.
Well, 2017, so it's we're in 2021 now, aren't we? So we've got 2017, 18, 19, 20, coming to the end of the 5th year. Emma's arithmetic's much better than mine.
It was a lucky guess.
Yeah, so we started in 2017. The elevated CO2 goes from, it depends on the leaf flush and the leaf fall, but it's basically from the beginning of April to the beginning of November.
Okay.
We don't add the carbon dioxide in the winter because there is nothing that a leafless plant can do with carbon dioxide. And we don't add it at night because photosynthesis requires sunlight, and so there's absolutely no point. So just not to be wasteful. It's during the day. Exactly. Yeah, we don't want to be sort of silly about it.
Exactly. But it is quite promising. In a way, it's promising about what's happening with the soil, I think, especially as we talked a lot in this series about regenerative agriculture and that type of thing. So if we're seeing trees being able to put more back into the soils, it hopefully paints quite a good picture that actually a lot of these things are fixable. Some of the issues are going to help create solutions, and if we're smart, and we start increasing tree cover and things like that, fingers crossed, I'm hopeful in that will at least contribute a little bit to the recovery.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of our big stories are going to come from below ground. Carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus budgets, once we see those playing out, it could well be that actually in this forest, which is we would hope that this is a pretty healthy kind of forest soil. If this can respond well, then I think in the situations that Emma is dealing with, where we're often dealing with very much more impoverished situations, there might be lessons that we can learn and transfer into that.
Yeah, definitely.
And in urban areas, that's where the people are, and people need trees.
Yeah.
So it's really important that we take care of our urban trees, even if they're not as extensive or perhaps as useful in terms of climate mitigation as our rural country parts.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's a good segue into what you're working on, because you're involved a lot with Network Rail and how they can use their sort of tree estate, which is a lot of green space that people might not think about. It's so important for connecting parts of the country.
I think we have to think about how we can maximise the value of every green space we have. So that's in our parks, in the urban areas, it's in private gardens, it's alongside our linear infrastructure. There's been some really great stuff happening in recent years where grass verges have suddenly become wildflower verges, and there's been changes in management practices by the big infrastructure operators such as Highways England and Network Rail to try and increase the amount of biodiversity along their linear infrastructure. And I'm quite a pragmatic person. Modern society needs urban areas, it needs infrastructure, it needs its energy, it needs its transport networks, and we need these grey assets, but they don't have to be detrimental to the natural environment. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to do. That's what I do in engineering. And it reminded me of the story you told when we came in here at the start, Rob. You said, we want this infrastructure in here to the civil engineers, but we don't want you to damage the forest. And this is what we say to the engineers. This is what we want our urban areas to look like. How can you make it happen?
Yeah, exactly. How can we incorporate these things? It's about being multifunctional, isn't it? We can have a road, but actually if it's tree lined, it's doing more than just providing transport. It's helping clean the air and provide shade and cool the surrounding areas. And, it has all those additional benefits for mental health and all of those things as well.
And we were just talking as well about how lovely it can be in Birmingham to just kind of wander off a road and find yourself in a forest that does look a little bit like this. It might not be as big, but it has its old oaks. It's got this really kind of countryside feel. You've got ancient hedgerows in parts of Birmingham. And I think it's really important that we integrate these kind of wild countryside spaces within our urban areas so that people can pass through them on their daily commute. People can commute along them because they provide a safe and sheltered way to move around the city. They're there for hot days, they're there for wet days. You know, if you have kids, you can go into an urban forest, whether it's sunny or rainy, and you can still play because the canopy provides you shelter no matter what. And within the UK, we've seen lots of flood events happening recently, and trees can help bear the weight of some of those extreme flood events. They intercept rainfall, and by intercepting that rainfall, by slowing it down, they slow down the time it takes for the rainwater to get into our drainage systems, or perhaps the water doesn't even reach the drainage systems at all. And that's the benefit of having really big urban trees and patches of land to kind of soak up these heavy rainfall events that we're experiencing more frequently as a consequence of climate change.
That's it, exactly. And you made a really good point earlier about the size of trees. Because there's obviously a huge amount of campaigns at the moment to plant trees, but we're still taking so many big trees out, and actually, a small little tree takes so long to reach the size of a mature tree that does so much more. They're kind of incomparable, really. And obviously, we do want to plant more trees to get there eventually, but it's not really a substitute. And the most important thing really is to protect what we have, and then try and enhance areas where there's nothing.
Mm-hmm. We have a calculator in one of the Trees and Design Action Group guides. I think it's Trees Planning and Development. And I think it shows that if you take out a relatively mature tree, that's just existing naturally, it's very happy, that it will take 90 years for another tree to, was that an acorn?
Yeah.
It will take 90 years for another tree to grow and provide that same benefit. So, there's this big campaign to plant more trees, get new trees into development, and all that's absolutely right. But it needs to be, we need to retain our existing trees, because if we retain our existing trees, we don't need to plant more. And perhaps some of the funding that we currently have from the Nature Climate Fund and other sources for getting new trees into the ground could be repurposed for protecting those trees that we already have.
Yeah. Really important to protect the trees that we have. And that whole area of how the built environment would view something like this and think about it as a starting point for some infrastructure project. Of course, in the past, the cheapest thing to do is just to raise everything, completely flatten and grade your ground, and then as an engineer, you just impose, everything is imposed from you. And I think we really have to get away from that imposition and start working with what we have already. It's incredibly important in the urban environment. This is actually a really good example of how it can be done, because there are no concrete foundations in our experimental patches. There are no gaps that were created in the canopy because they used the existing. You can see even here there are lighter patches and darker patches, so natural occurring patches of gaps and so on. And that's what we need to be encouraging the built environment to think about. What have I got here? What a resource. The other side of what you've both been talking about just now that comes to mind is this: when it comes to what benefit am I getting from this green infrastructure as a grey infrastructure owner. There are those two sides. There's the immediate climate impact or impact on heat transfer. The heat balance, the temperature, the whole thing, and also water transfer, as you were just saying, Emma. And then there's the longer, slower net zero question. And for that, you need to know where your carbon is being locked away. And even old trees, they are a brilliant solution, but they are only century scale solutions, 100 years, many decades to 100 years, a couple of 100 years. For climate, we need to be locking carbon dioxide away for many, many hundreds of years, thousands of years. Forests can be really important in that by building really long-term carbon stores in the soil. other trees in other places can also do that if you give them the opportunity, and if they're allowed the time to do that. But then the shorter term carbon story, by which I mean even things like the stem of a tree, we need to do something with that carbon, put it away, let the forest continue to grow. I don't mean flatten forests. I mean, take wood carefully out of forests, use it. Be fantastic if we used more of it for building. But I think in the end of the day, that's not going to soak up enough carbon. We're going to have to end up putting it either as wood or as burnt, as CO2, so burn the wood, capture the CO2, and then pipe that down into where the fossil fuel was. So carbon capture and storage. I think in terms of really getting on top of climate change, trees have a really important part to play, but we must not think of them as a silver bullet. Otherwise, we're going to kid ourselves that we've done the job.
Yeah, and as you said, the time frame is just too long.
Yeah.
It's not really usable it's not usable in the time we need it, which is one of the big challenges. Yeah. But they do also have so many other benefits that you can see much sooner, which leads more back onto what you're involved with.
Network Rail, I work with them to understand the impact of weather on their infrastructure.
Right, okay, yeah.
So how heat causes train delays, and understanding how they can make their infrastructure resilient to longer term climate change. So Network Rail have a really good weather resilience climate change adaptation strategy. I think it's world leading. It might even be the best in the world. And as part of vegetation management is part of that, and that's why we're really keen to work with them and perhaps have a PhD student with Network Rail to understand how they can maximise the ecosystem services associated with the linear forest, but equally make it manageable for Network Rail because they don't need more leaves on the line.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Adhesion causes them problems every year. Adhesion is leaves on the line, making them slippy. Trains can't stop. It's a problem.
Yeah, very big problem.
Yeah, especially in urban areas like Birmingham, where you have lots of greenery and you have short distance between stations, and that's why the what do they call it? The leaf time. The autumn timetabling cuts out certain stations, and it's because the trains can't necessarily slow down as quickly, I think.
Because you always think of it as I always think of it with my, novice hat on. I always think, can't be that bad. Just a few leaves. Just put a brush on the front of the train and it'll be all
Well, they do that in the morning. They have a train that goes up and it cleans all the tracks, but it makes this really kind of sticky glue stuff. I mean, you must have slipped on leaves as a person,
Yes.
No, yeah, they are. And they do really stick to stuff as well. They're not necessarily that easy to get off once they're on things.
That's right. I was once there was an October day when it had been raining really heavily, and we were waiting for the train. It was late, and when I got on the train, they told me that I think it was some point earlier in the line towards Barn Green or maybe Bromsgrove, the train had been struggling to go uphill because there'd been so many leaves on the line, and it had been such a full train, it was kind of slipping backwards down it, and that was why it was late.
Yeah. So this is the thing, you quite often don't understand where many of these issues come from. And we talked about earlier generally about lots of issues, and you can't pin any one issue down to climate change, but this is a slightly different example because it's something that happens every year, but a lot of the other issues we are seeing an increased frequency in terms of water and all of this type of thing. But you are seeing these big infrastructure players get more engaged. Highways England now are basically, as you've already said, are basically looking at putting tree-lined streets on pretty much every new road. So that's a huge win in terms of increasing tree cover.
Yeah, so Highways England are now national highways. And they look after the strategic road network. So the big trunk roads going through the country, they're the ones they're taking care of and making sure that their embankments can be biodiverse. In terms of street-lined trees within our urban areas, that's through local authority planning, and the RTPI have a new campaign at the moment. I think it's called Retree Fit, and it's about all new developments being tree-lined, and that's
good name, very good name, yeah. Points for whoever came up with that.
And I think it's the current chair, and and this is why people are so important. It's somebody's vision in the planning world that we should have street-lined trees, and that they're able to make it happen. And so,
Yeah, no, it is really important. I wanted to ask a bit as well about how you both came into these roles, because you're a chemist, and your background is more in climate and
geography. I guess, yeah. Go for it, Rob.
Well, I came in because as a chemist who was interested in the chemistry of the atmosphere, I started studying the reactive compounds that come out of trees. They're released from trees. They're often produced by trees as a defense against insects and even animals grazing them. But they turn out to be very important in atmospheric chemistry. So I studied that 30 years ago and have studied it on and off ever since, but always trying not to get too involved with the trees. I was more involved with the atmospheric chemistry. But then when I came to Birmingham to work on urban resilience. So a lot of the stuff that actually we've been talking about today, but the opportunity to look at forest resilience to climate came through, and we pitched the idea of this FACE experiment, and we were lucky enough to get it funded. I was always supposed to be the caretaker, and a real expert was due to arrive any day. And then here we are 5 years later. And
I'll be here one day.
I'm still doing it, yeah. So that I've kind of come in sideways and by accident. But that's been a really, in some ways, that's been quite a good way for me to do things, because I've been able to admit how naive and ignorant I am in a broad community and a varied community of people who are interested in what we're doing here. And I think that's opened, just go back to Emma's point about people, it's opened conversations with many more people than I think it would have been the case otherwise, because people don't see me as coming with an agenda.
It's all about collaboration, isn't it? Sometimes you're best having somebody who doesn't know as much in a role like this, because that forces everybody to work together and explain what you need. And
yeah, you can get an understanding of the bigger picture as well, which is really important, because you quite often end up with so many people sort of pigeonholed or in very specific niches that you often don't see that bigger picture or how things are kind of connected beyond any one bit.
Yeah.
They've done a lot of work at Birmingham City Council on a project that was funded by the Future Parks Accelerator, thinking about how green infrastructure can be managed differently within the city. So the traditional way of managing green infrastructure is that it will be in charge it will be the responsibility of the parks team, and the parks team is one of those budgets that often can get cut because, parks, for everything they offer us, they can never be as important as perhaps children or adults who need extra funding. And so to try and work through this, they've thought about how parks can be managed differently, how green infrastructure can be part of every part of decision making within the local authority, how it can be integrated within planning. And in the next couple of weeks, I think Birmingham will be releasing the Urban Forest Master Plan. And Birmingham's the first city in the UK to have an Urban Forest Master Plan. And that kind of sets out its vision for Birmingham's green infrastructure for the future. And it considers a whole kind of all sorts of different things, such as climate change, but also environmental justice, and how can we make sure that parts of Birmingham have the green infrastructure that they don't have as part of and can green infrastructure be a mechanism for levelling up and that kind of thing. So it's every part of the city that's pulled together to create this urban forest master plan for the future.
No, it's good. It's really good to see. It'll be really important for influencing so many decisions.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
That's the plan. In terms of how I ended up doing this, I don't really know. My PhD was about changing rainfall patterns in Cumbria, and I could tell that rainfall patterns were changing in Cumbria. And so I went out and I spoke to the people of Cumbria, to the farmers, and they would say, yes, we have these awful storms, they're coming in more in October, they're stronger. I've really noticed a difference here. And I would speak to people who have been flooded, lots of parts of Cumbria have been flooded a lot recently. And they would look to me for answers, what should we be doing? How can we stop the flooding from happening? What should we be doing? You're the academic, you're the scientist, you tell me. And I didn't have the answers that these people needed. And that really made me think about what I wanted to do as an academic, and that I wanted to be very much in this ground between academia and practice, to make sure that the research we do at universities is useful, and that we know that it's useful because we listen to the stakeholder needs, the people out there, and then we use that to drive the research agenda forward. And so that's how I came into this, by thinking about, well, who needs to know about rainfall? And that led me to infrastructure, and then led me to trees being the solution to everything. But then when I spoke to local authorities about this kind of perception that trees would be the solution, it was at a time when there was it was during austerity and really big budget cuts to parks. And they were saying, well, we can't plant trees, we can't keep them alive. And that's what led me to where I am. Trying to think about green infrastructure as part of decision making, as part of environment, as engineering projects, and as part of planning, so that we have it now and also in the future.
For resituating that, that's the change that I've seen happening through work that Emma and others have done, is that just that repositioning of green things in urban areas inside the way that urban areas are conceived. Yeah. I think we are making real forward motion there.
Oh, definitely. It's becoming seen as such an asset, which I think perhaps it was kind of seen more negatively, where it was, oh god, we've got to deal with all this stuff. Whereas now it's kind of, there's a lot of ways to save money through it, especially like sustainable drainage systems. You can obviously incorporate trees and all this type of thing. And we've just got to change the way we approach design. I mean, it's a lot of what we do. We look at new sites and we look at it and we go, okay, what ecology do we have? Where's the water going to go? Okay, well, actually, let's connect these areas up, and this new area we're creating to connect them will take all the water as well. And you're tying up all of these issues and things in, kind of the beginning of the site design. And then actually after you've done all that, you go, okay, now what do we have left for the housing? And you can build in, the ponds and the wetlands and everything else to deal with all this water, and you might think, oh, building a wetland costs a lot, but actually putting pipes in the ground and connecting to sewerage and all this type of stuff is much more expensive, and in some cases technically challenging, than some of these softer solutions, which have a huge myriad of benefits. And that kind of shift in our understanding of design and how to approach urban areas, and also what people want now. People want gardens and green spaces nearby that they can go and explore, now more than ever. So all of that is adding more and more pressure. And also, people's opinions in society is changing. And there's not just a transition in the way we kind of see the natural world. It's kind of people's relationship to it is changing. And, I have a lot of friends who were never really, I had a small interest, but not really, they were just doing whatever they were doing. And a lot of them are thinking now about actually, I want to get involved more in this. I see it as the future, and they're sort of looking at changing careers, and they're sort of, mid to late 20s. So there's a lot of change happening at so many different levels now, which is sort of propelling this environmental story forward, which, spreads a lot of positivity, really.
Yeah, we do get, inside the Institute, we do get career shifters coming in from time to time. They're often brilliant, to be absolutely honest, because they've got skill sets honed out in whatever world they've been working in, that they can bring into whatever they choose to study inside Bifor, and it often works really, really well. It's a very good way of expanding and getting away from groupthink. But this idea that you're talking about there, where value engineering is going to sort of turn away, so it's not going to be get rid of all the trees and pretty things because they're just a cost. It's actually gone right round on its head, and these are the things that are saving us money.
Exactly, yeah. And adding value, because a lot of houses near greenery sell for more. Yeah. So there's an incentive there. A bit of gentrification maybe in a way, but once it becomes the norm, you kind of lose that side of things. So there's even more of a case to make it the norm. It should be the standard, and often deprived areas are the ones least green, and they're the ones that need it more.
Yeah.
So there's such a huge drive to start doing all these things.
Yeah.
I think that's something that lockdown really brought out. We all got our hours worth of exercise outside during the first lockdown last year. And for me, living close to one of Birmingham's beautiful urban parks, it was very easy for me to go and sit and play in the stream and play under the shade of the trees. And we had all the space we needed. We could, even in lockdown, we could still go to the park and not see people, not be within 2 meters distance of anybody else. But living in high-rise accommodation in parts of Birmingham, or densely compact terraced accommodation, there are no green spaces nearby, and the space, the amount of green space per person wasn't simply sufficient. People would go out to go and exercise, but there just wasn't anywhere for them to go.
Yeah, it's really sad. And even street trees make such a big difference to some of those areas.
And it also highlighted how unuseful some of the green areas were. Just a patch of grass, what can you do in that? I mean, you can play football on it, but if it's raining, you'll still get wet. If it's sunny, you'll be too hot. You need urban forests, I think.
Yeah, and there's so many innovative ways to introduce them as well. I mean, I was, and this was from New Yorker actually, but they had basketball courts, but the basketball courts had trees in the court. So the whole court had a canopy. So you had to play round the trees, which kind of added another element of challenge to it. But it meant they could play even in the day when it was really hot.
Yeah.
So there's little innovative solutions like that. We don't have to have the standard cookie cutter. This is what every single basketball court has to be like. It can be like, let's make something a bit quirky. It's a bit different, and actually, in human terms, they're the things that often stick with people. People will be more inclined to most likely go to that one because it's another challenge, because it's a bit different, and it has a totally different atmosphere and feel to it.
Yeah. Well, creativity is so important. Innovation, really, really important. Lots and lots of diversity. In the rural areas where we've got big, reasonably sized forests, diversity is absolutely key. If we don't do that, then we are so vulnerable to climate change and the undiverse forests kind of being pushed into an uncomfortable position where they're not really functioning the way they should. But also, of course, pests and diseases just running, amok through those monocultures. So we need to try and get that mix right. We need that diversity. It's really important.
Yeah.
And also diversity in kind of the way that we research the urban forests. So, as groups of people, but also as kind of academic disciplines. And linked to the Bifold face experiment here is the Bifold Forest Edge programme, which has lots of research happening in all different aspects of trees. So we have, what do we have, Rob? We have
the psychology of being in green spaces. We've got some hard science looking at, in fact, it relates to your sticky leaves or slippy leaves, because it's about leaf waxes and how they might change over geological time, but also in response to rapid climate change. We've got cultural studies looking at the influence of various forest literatures, or literature that includes forests as a setting, on people's environmental feelings of connection to nature. We've got mathematicians doing all the hard sums on how diseases propagate along forest roads, and all of those different aspects, flooding, sustainable drainage systems, those kind of areas. So, and in fact now getting into the rewilding arena through things like beavers and other aspects there.
Exactly, and getting predators back and all that type of thing to control deer and all those things. I mean, we've talked a lot in this series about regenerative agriculture and how we kind of need to approach all of that. So it is such an incredibly interesting time. I'm a bit conscious that we're now getting wet. So shall we go for a wander through the woods and maybe meet some of the other researchers and see what they're doing here as well?
For sure, yeah, let's do it.
Okay, super.
So here we are in the forest, at the forest lab, so behind me, and in a moment we'll go and talk to Carolina, who's making measurements of photosynthesis. So that's the first step in the process, if you like to think of it that way, where we see how the plants respond to the extra carbon dioxide that's around them in our experimental patches. In fact, she can make these measurements in the lab because for the patches she's looking at today, different patches, we've cut a branch and we're testing it in the lab. What we also have here is our what we call the Flux lab and Flux tower. So this is a tower which is designed to, we've got instruments at the top which make measurements of carbon dioxide, methane, temperature, water vapor, make those measurements very quickly. And if you make them quickly enough, you can find the difference between air that's moving upwards and air that's moving downwards. And on average, the difference between the upward air and the downward moving air tells you whether the forest is emitting a compound or taking it up. So we can see how energy and gas components of the atmosphere are being exchanged with the whole forest. So now not just thinking about those small experimental patches of extra CO2. And this is the kind of infrastructure that's used all around the world to give us that understanding of the this free gift that plants are giving us in terms of absorbing carbon dioxide globally.
We can measure photosynthetic rates with this instrument. Now I am just measuring oak leaves and hazel leaves. these are species-specific traits normally, and in this case we have two very different species, hazel and oak. Hazel is a fast-growing species compared to oak, which is a much slower-growing species, so it's more complicated to open their stomata because the wood traits are different between both species. So now I am struggling with the oaks trying to make their stomata to get open, and that's basically what this instrument does.
Okay. And what are you hoping to find?
What?
What are you hoping to find?
Well, we hope to find improvement in the physiological parameters that are, well, what I am doing is measuring a response curve of photosynthetic rates versus CO2 concentrations. Once you measure this curve, you can feed the curve and extract the parameters. These parameters are very valuable in terms of ecology because they are used by Earth system modelers to calculate how much CO2 will be uptake in different biomes. So I expect, after parameterizing this curve, that these parameters that indicates the maximum carboxylation capacity of the tree and the maximum electron transport rate will increase with more nutrients in the soil because we have applied nitrogen and we have applied phosphorus in the Quintus plots. Now I am not working in the phase arrays, but in the Quintus plots. Quintus is a project in which we are assessing the nutrient effect, so the fertilization effect on many different variables, including physiological variables. I hope I have explained this somehow.
Very complicated.
It's a lot of information, no? I'm trying to just explain what I am doing, but it's basically that, but it's a lot of things to consider, yeah. Many parameters.
Why is the branch in the bucket? That was my first question when I came
Yeah,
here.
well, ideally, we would rather prefer to go up to the tree and measure, and that's why we've got, in the phase arrays, we've got this system, the swing with the engine that lifts us up. But the Quintus plot do not have this canopy access system, so we need to use the detached branches. And this is also one more factor that complicates my measurements because it obviously affects the stomatal behavior of the tree. So I keep the branches inside of water. I keep them like for one day to get them to stabilize and then reveal the flow up to through the vessels of the branch. Yeah, ideally I would rather prefer to go up, but we cannot do that with these Quintus plots.
Yeah, so there's lots of different projects running out here. There's the main project, the Bifor First experiment, and then there's lots of separate academic projects which have received funding to look at different specific aspects of the forest ecosystem. So Quintus, is that?
Quintus is a parallel experiment. It's not parallel. We use variables that we get from the phase arrays, but we also have 13 more plots where we have added in some plots we have added nitrogen, in other plots we've added phosphorus, and in 3 more plots we have added both nitrogen and phosphorus. So it will help us to see if there is any nutrient limitation to the CO2 uptake of these trees.
And that's been the great thing about the Bifold Face site is it's been there's the experiment happening here itself, but then it's also been a catalyst for all sorts of related research across the university. So there's the kind of physical experiments that are happening out here on site, but we also have a PhD program that's kind of linking to all different aspects of the university, through to engineering, through to English, through to languages, and people are doing research connected to forests in all different disciplines.
Okay.
And so at the moment we're pulling together an anthology of how stories of trees, how different tree stories have influenced the research you do. So I'm talking about the Lorax, which is by Dr. Seuss, which is do you know the Lorax?
Yeah.
It's a really sad story. Or maybe it's a story of hope, but it's basically the story of capitalism and deforestation, about how chopping down a forest until there's nothing left apart from one seed. And so I think about that a lot and how important it is to try and keep everything that we have. And I think it's the kind of book that all kids should read in school as well. But some people see it as a hopeful book because, you have that one seed, you can regrow back the forest. But for me, it's really sad.
So earlier you mentioned about installing all of this equipment and having no impact on the forest. So, and obviously looking around, there's some pretty big bits of kit and there's a lot of stuff. So could you maybe explain a bit about how it was actually installed and why it was so important to not have an impact on the forest?
Yeah, for sure, Niall. So what you can see when you get up close to this infrastructure is that these big metal towers are not in a regular array. They're put in the gaps in the forest. They were lowered in by helicopter, by a very special helicopter and a very special helicopter crew. They're not guyed in place. They're bolted onto these platforms I'm standing on partly just now, and the platforms themselves are screwed into the ground using these enormous screws. So we had a big team of builders in here in the forest for about a year, just screwing the platforms in, rather than taking big diggers and heavy machinery into the forest. Because once you start churning up the soil, you break the connection between the plants and the microbial communities. And we were very, very concerned to minimize that. And then in the canopy, we wanted to minimize breaks, openings in the canopy that let light in and change the ecology around each patch. So those were the instructions we gave the engineering team. And actually, they were brilliant. They totally got it. They totally could do it. So when they were given that as the remit, they could do it. Yeah. Of course, if we hadn't told them that, the sensible thing to do is just flatten the place and then put the trees back when you're finished. But exactly. We explained to them why that's not possible. And I think in the built environment, there are lots and lots of situations where that same conversation could happen. It's just not possible to flatten everything and then put a tree back in and expect you to be having the same kind of ecological and environmental service that you had when the tree was in its right place.
No, definitely. I mean, the screws you've got here, the big steel screws going in, that's something that's being used now in a lot of sort of root protection areas when you have to bridge over tree root systems where you've got to have access through them or whatever as an alternative way of having a very, very low impact. You know, there's so much technology now as well to scan where roots are. Yeah. You can go and actually see where the roots are and pick the points where you'll miss them. So there's even less impact. So actually it's a very, very low impact way of construction and how to approach problems.
That's brilliant. And that ground penetrating sensing, ground penetrating radar is fantastic technology. It's a little bit hard for us to use in a situation like this where everything is kind of interconnected. We haven't got a standalone tree. And a lot of the roots that we're interested in the first instance, the roots that we're interested in are very, very fine, 1 millimeter in diameter or even less. And so we have to use different techniques to see those. Sometimes we have to take a cylinder of soil away and process it in the lab. And we'll process it for roots and for microbes and for chemicals, particularly the nutrients. Other times we use video cameras fed down below ground through Pyrex tubes, and then we can just time and again look at the same piece of soil and watch the root growing month by month through that through the season. And another of the so one of the results that we've seen since we began is that increase in fine root growth in a patch like this that has got extra carbon dioxide being fed to it. So although the carbon dioxide is coming in via the leaves right up at the top, so 75 feet above my head, and we have to make measurements of that, and we make measurements by winching our researchers up on a chair with their piece of kit, like the kit that Carolina is using today. And but what we're seeing is changes up at the top of the canopy, provoking changes below ground.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, so why is it you're up in the canopy? Because that's where all the photosynthesis takes place.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So of course, anywhere where you can see a leaf around you here, the plant has gambled that there's an opportunity for photosynthesis. And generally speaking, if the leaf looks healthy, then it must be getting enough light to allow it to generate photosynthesis and generate sugar. But the major part of that is happening in the most sunlit part of the canopy, which is, as I say, 25 meters, 75 feet above our heads. Yeah. We can also look at other things that are happening up there around insect assemblies and so on. But principally, we want to get up there to measure the carbon coming into the forest And then everything we're doing below here, at this level and below ground, is about carbon being stored or being lost from the forest.
Okay, fascinating. And what other experiments are you doing here on the ground? Because there's a lot of stuff going on the ground, isn't there? So there's some plates down, I think, to stop compaction. I assume
Yes,
walking around
that's exactly
on
right.
a raised platform here. But then there's also lots of little robots we've seen as well in some places, and lots of like terracotta rings stuck to the trees. So could you maybe explain a bit about what some of those are, and maybe
what are those sticks in the black tubes over there?
The black tubes?
That's an experiment looking at seedlings. It turns out that those are poplar seedlings, because poplar can be. We've got good genetics for poplar, and we understand these are clones. So we're looking at how they perform under elevated CO2. And in previous seasons, we had potted seedlings of all kinds, including oak, just to look at that young, what's happening with juvenile trees. Everywhere you can see a white square, we're doing something. It usually means we're putting something into the ground, leaving it there, then taking it away to analyze it. Yeah. Or sometimes we're taking a piece of soil from there. And then, of course, we have to just put a flag in to say, don't go back to that piece of ground because we've already taken it away. The soil scientists always want more soil, and I'm always telling them they can't have as much as they want. Otherwise, this would turn into a kind of Swiss cheese. We've got the camera. Oh, we've got these collars that you were asking about, Niall. Yeah, so the collars on the ground and on the side of the stems do the same thing. They're about measuring the respiration that's going on. So remember, respiration, that's just what we do, what every living thing does to generate energy from food. So that produces carbon dioxide. So we measure the increase in carbon dioxide coming from the soil. That can come from the roots, the living roots in the soil, but can also come from the fungi and the microbes and the insects, all that are alive in that patch of soil. So we measure that respiration, but we also do that in the trees, on the stems, because we're beginning to realize more and more that there is a community of microbes, there's a microbiome on the tree and in the tree stem and on the tree leaves, as well as in the ground and as well as in us. We're quite used to now, I think, of thinking about our gut microbiome.
Yeah.
Same sort of issues apply.
Okay. And what are some of the other ones? So you've got some of the bowls and the nets and things.
Yeah. So the nets are just simple collectors for litter. This is a deciduous forest.
So leaf litter.
Leaf litter. That's right. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Floating in.
Yes. Yeah. We really don't want plastic bags and other things like that. So of course, in the autumn time, the leaves will come off and will be collected in all these, well, not all of it, but a representative sample will be collected, dried and analysed to help us understand what the leaf is like, how what its nutrient balance is like, what its size and shape is, and so on. We've also got high-tech equipment here in the shape of plastic pudding bowls, which just have a shallow layer of water with some surfactant, some washing up liquid in the water, and flying insects will then be trapped. They'll come down to feed on to drink at the water, and because the surface tension has changed, they're trapped rather than being able to get away. Wow. So again, our entomologists, in order to understand what's happening, they need to see what insects we've got here, so we have to trap some. And there are various ways of doing that. We've got kind of tents which trap flying insects, and we've got those traps and traps in the ground that the crawling insects will fall into. So, the PhD that was working on those, it's just finished, Liam Crowley. I think he had 65,000 insect samples from through his PhD. So he spent a lot of time.
That's a lot of time.
Looking down the microscope, sorting out his flies from his microscopic wasps and his this from that. So
didn't he find some different species or something here?
Yes, he did find. He's always finding new species whenever he comes. But he did find the first specimen of a particular wasp that had been ever seen in the West Midlands. So that was a nice find.
wow.
And that's quite a good story, actually, Emma, because that wasp is a flightless wasp that lives in molehills. And so there is
a very unique habitat.
Yeah, so there is no way you would just come across it by accident.
Yeah.
You need to be in this kind of very heavily measured, instrumented and characterized forest to really see to see that kind of thing.
What's even more interesting is I don't think I've seen any molehills since we've been here. So
No, that's true. Funnily enough, no, not that many. Although we do have some vertebrates, some small furry vertebrates, and some big ones, badgers and things.
One of the interesting conversations we had very early on in the podcast with this guy called Ted Green and lady Jill Butler, who are behind a lot of the rewilding projects, sort of NEP and a lot of work there, and they were sort of saying that a lot of species we find in sort of woodlands and species that we consider to be very rare actually are from a much more diverse range of habitats. They're just surviving in these habitats because they've kind of been pushed there.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting when you find species in areas where you otherwise wouldn't attribute them to be. And they might actually just be not necessarily endemic to that kind of area, but they're just kind of hanging on there or found a little niche they can kind of survive in that's separate from what they would normally be.
Yeah, I mean, without getting too sort of into a sort of putting my academic hat on too much, I think we do have some real issues in a quite a crowded place like the United Kingdom. With finding enough space for nature is really a problem, and a lot of what we look at as natural or semi-natural landscape is missing huge parts of what would normally be there. The mosaic of different kinds of habitats, but also the different kinds of animals that you would expect to see. And yes, you can get some animals pushed back into refuges because that's the only place where they can get on with things without being disturbed. So this is not an ecologically complete system, just like every other forest in the UK, but it's complete enough for us to see quite a lot of the cycles happening. But I think looking further forward, there's a really big research agenda about reintroducing more keystone species and seeing how they interact.
Yeah.
Of course, then when you think about places where that Emma's interested in, where people are, there are lots of different tensions that start to emerge very quickly about how, especially large animals, are perceived. So grey squirrels in green infrastructure in urban habitats are often very welcome from users. You know, people love to see them in the trees. In forested habitats in the countryside, there's a problem with the fact that they're not predated. They become too populous and start to degrade the forest. In fact, I can see a sycamore there that's been chewed in half, probably as a result of grey squirrel damage. Yeah. So interesting tensions sort of coming through in different places.
But I think there's an opportunity for everybody in an urban area to think about how they can improve biodiversity. Yeah. There's been quite a lot about it on Gardener's World, and I've noticed, I live in a Birmingham suburb, and I've noticed that people in the last couple of years have been letting their grass grow, and I asked a couple of people about it, and they said they'd seen it on Gardener's World, and so they were giving it a go. And so I think, mindsets and attitudes towards nature have really changed in recent years, and that's great. The other thing I've been looking at while we've been stood here is when we think about how this was created and how we managed to create this really tall, great infrastructure without damaging the green infrastructure, it gives me real hope for what engineers can do in our urban areas without destroying what existing green habitat we already have. But I also think it's kind of like the other side of the coin to what we see in urban areas. Our urban areas are very kind of pristine and grey and neat, and the trees are kind of in their little plots, and everything's very neat and tidy. And here the trees have kind of overtaken the grey infrastructure. So you've got moss and lichen and stuff growing all over the grey stuff, and it's covered in leaf litter, and it's like the opposite of what we see in our cities. It's really nice.
And it still works, so it's okay to get leaves on your grade infrastructure.
It's perfectly
fine.
okay. Yeah, as long as you understand.
Nothing has
what's going
fallen
on.
over. You know, it's
Yeah.
okay to give nature a little bit of space.
A little bit of space and a little bit of latitude. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Emma. Actually, I find myself reaching out to begin tidying when I'm walking through the forest, and then I have to stop myself. I mean, that's not what we're about here. This is meant to be ramshackle, disorganized, because that's nature just working its way through.
Indeed. I mean, we discussed it off the podcast earlier about dead wood and how we kind of need to reapproach how we look at that. And I mentioned that on a lot of our projects, when trees have to come out, or they have to be, whether it be for development or people just don't want them anymore, we really make a very strong case that they try and make the trees safe and remove everything as much as they can. And then they leave the standing dead wood there, and we plant around it like some shrubs, so you end up with these kind of skeletons sticking out, and they become a bit of a feature. And maybe we get climbers or something up them as well, because they're so important for insect life and everything else. And obviously, carbon is there for a bit longer than it would otherwise be if it was just chopped down and burnt for firewood or something. So there's a lot of approaches to that. And Emma, you've done a lot of work on this type of thing, of how you look at a tree and kind of you work back. If you can't keep it, what's the next best thing?
Yeah, so we came up, I think we call it 6 steps to tree success or something. It's something we'll be sharing soon, I think, from the TDAG website.
Such a waddy song, that.
Really?
Too early a reference for you, but
Just a little bit, Rob. So so it's basically it's just thinking about how can we keep nature and green space on a development site. So your first question is, can we keep the trees? Okay, if we can't keep all of the trees, which key, let's value them. Let's work out how much ecosystem services they're providing to us, and then let's make sure that we reinvest that ecosystem services in some kind of new planting. If that new planting can't be on the actual estate nearby, can it be nearby? And if trees have to come down, can we keep the dead wood on site? And it's just about turning the idea of development on its head. Instead of thinking it, like we were talking about earlier, instead of thinking about it as, just this flat space and then everything comes from it, it's what do we have now? How do we weave stuff into it? And I think if we can start thinking more like that, that will help to return trees and the habitats that they support in our urban areas.
Yeah, you also asked a really interesting question about the soil and the depth of the soil.
Yes.
So I think that would be quite a good thing to kind of cover. We asked it off the podcast,
yes.
So we should probably bring it in because again, it's something people often don't realise. And I often see pictures of trees where the tree's as big underground as it is above the ground, and but the same sort of depth type thing. And obviously that's not necessarily the case. It isn't the case.
It's not the case, generally speaking. I mean, to have 25 meters of soil for a tree to expand freely into, there's probably hardly any place. There's hardly anywhere on Earth that would be the case. Trees can put tap roots down very deep. There's been some amazing studies done over many decades, actually, where if you take an excavator and you dig, you find tap roots going really, really deep. But generally speaking, the trees are having to make do with the space between the litter layer, which you can see very clearly here, the what we would think of as the top of the ground, and hard rock. In this case, it's hard sandstone rock. And also in this case, there's a layer of hard clay between the trees and the sandstone rock. So generally speaking, they won't go below the clay unless there's cracks in that clay that they can work through and round. So a lot of what's happening below ground here, although it's incredibly important, it's happening in 30 centimeters from the ground surface, so just the length of a ruler, maybe down to a meter. We think we're seeing some activity all the way down to a meter, but it's tapering up. It's tapering off. It's very much in that. In fact, even in the top 10 centimeters, it's a huge amount of activity happening because that's where all the nutrients are being recycled by the trees and their roots, but also by the fungi and the other microbes.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, people often don't think we often call it the sort of the root plate, which you see in forestry a lot when a tree comes down. It lifts up that very relatively small area.
Yes.
And that tends to be where the thicker, stronger roots are.
Yeah.
And in some soils, it's even shallower. Chalk soils, it's very, very thin.
Yeah,
there isn't that capacity for trees' roots to actually go very deep at all.
No.
People often don't realise that. You think there's this great big depth of soil. And this is something we looked at again in another podcast with John Little, where we talked about some of the experiments he's doing using sort of waste construction materials like crushed brick and crushed concrete, and how he's using that actually instead of soil, which has a number of benefits because it's low nutrient, which means there's less competition for things like wildflowers and species that live on very low nutrient soils, which we've lost a lot of in this country.
Yes, yeah.
And also it's very, very low carbon because you quite often can source it very locally.
Yeah.
You're recycling the material.
Yeah.
And there's much, much, much less maintenance because without the nutrients, there isn't the competition, which means it's less input from you to kind of manage and maintain.
Yeah, no, I think there's lots of important and innovative work going on in that area. It's changing the way that urban spaces are conceived of and how you manage them. I mean, if I was to dig out 30 centimeters of soil here, by the time you get down to that level, it actually looks like building sand down here a lot of the time, because it's not that rich, mulchy, organic soil all the way down. That's certainly there at the top, but once you get a few tens of centimeters down, it's either very hard clay or it's this crumbly, sandy soil. So yeah, trees are very, very good at using the below ground resource effectively for anchorage and for nutrients. But this is not a high nutrient sort of system. It's not like crops where you're taking away a lot of the essential nutrient to feed us. So you're taking away where all the nitrogen has gone into the seeds. You're taking that away in your harvest, and then you're going to have to put that back in. Otherwise, the soil is just going to run out of its nutrients. Here, we're looking at something much closer to a closed system. It's not entirely closed. There's some interesting issues around that, but it's much more like that. And that also means that it's surprising and challenging for us to understand why increasing the carbon dioxide is something that allows the trees to at least increase their take-up of carbon dioxide. Whether it allows them to store it or not is something we still have to find out.
Yeah, look forward to finding it out and hearing all the stories at the end.
Yeah, come back and when we're at the end of this is started in 2017. I think we said that earlier, and it's guaranteed to go out for 10 growing seasons to the end of 2026. Okay. And that's not a terrific length of experiment as far as these oaks are concerned, because they're about 175 years old. But it's a long time for a science experiment to run.
It is, yeah.
And
especially
certainly
so much kit.
Yeah, so come back and we'll tell you how things are going later on.
What we found out.
Yeah, for sure.
What are the main hopes you think you'll have at the end of this? How do you think you're going to use what you found? Do you know yet? Or is it still quite uncertain as you're not sure how things are going to end up?
Well, of course, of course, there are still, there's still the possibility that what we're going to see is, it could go either way in terms of carbon storage. But my guess at the moment is that we'll be able to say something about how to manage these established forests, temperate forests, for carbon. I think we'll be able to say quite a lot of detail about that going forward. And that's important because at the moment we're planting trees like crazy, but very quickly, just in a few decades, they're going to be getting to be established forests. And we need to think about how to manage them properly, because we can't just plant more and more forests forever. We have to think about managing the forests as forests for carbon.
I look forward to hearing how it all goes.
Yeah, well, you'll be very welcome back now.
Yeah, it would be good to come back and see the end, maybe get some of the helicopter coming in and taking the stuff out, because that's the other thing we haven't mentioned is all of this has got to come back out of the woodland. That's
the commitment we've made. So this is a £50 million program of research. Well, in fact, that's not really the research. That's just the infrastructure and making the experiment run. So it's fairly significant, even on global terms. It's along with two other experiments. There are three roughly similar-sized experiments that are the biggest experiments of global change in the world. So this is a big experiment. It was made possible by philanthropic giving and also by the university itself. And that also makes it unusual because most of these experiments are government funded.
Yeah.
But the philanthropy was really important here because it allowed us to think, in fact, it insisted, the donor insisted that we were ambitious. So rather than going back to the philanthropist and saying, well, could I just do the same thing I've been doing for the last 10 years, but with more money? Yeah. It was really about changing the game. And that's what I think we've done with Bifold Face. We've really changed the state of research, certainly in the UK forest sector, but I think right across the temperate zone.
So are those other projects part of the same sort of investment and scheme? Are they?
No, they were separately funded and funded by their own separate schemes. But the one of those is another face facility like this one, but in eucalyptus forest, old eucalyptus forest, just outside Sydney. We work very closely with that one. And then we're hoping that there'll be more forest face facilities to build up that network, because of course, we want to know about the temperate forest. We want to know about the eucalyptus forest, which is a good example of a type kind of Mediterranean type climate. But we want to know about the rainforest. We want to know about the boreal forest, of course.
Isn't there
where's the last one?
an Amazon face?
Yeah.
Amazon face. So Amazon face is also on the cards. We're very, very hopeful of that going forward soon.
So that's a potential new one.
That would be a new one, and that would be rainforest, the sort of super wet rainforest. And then, were you asking about the last?
Third one.
Yeah, boreal. So boreal meaning the northern, round the Arctic, those big Siberian and Scandinavian and Canadian forests.
No, I thought you mentioned there were 3 sites.
Sorry. Yeah, actually, the third big experiment that is ongoing is in Minnesota. It uses a slightly different setup. It uses containment. So there are these.
That's created biomes.
Yeah, basically, yeah, they're called open top chambers. So they have exchange at the top, but they've got walls, and they're looking in bog. It's a really fascinating, really fascinating project at that tree line to bog transition. So they've got tiny little spruce trees, but lots of sphagnum moss and those kind of things in there. And of course they have to be even more careful than we are about getting in, not putting your foot in it.
Okay, brilliant. Should we move on to the
next
bit?
Let's go.
Okay, so here we are back at the cars. Thank you very much for having us. But while we're here, I just thought it'd be really interesting to talk about the actual CO2, and you can see it here in the tanks behind us. And it's just interesting to find out how much is actually used and how it gets from here into the forest.
Yes, well, coming back to the beginning of the system for us, having looked at the science inside the forest, this is where it begins. So one milk tanker full of liquid CO2 a day, sometimes even 2, come through the country lanes into the site and then offload into these containers which hold the pure liquid CO2. And then, depending on how strong the wind is, we release, carefully computer-controlled release of the CO2, warm it up, turn it into a gas, pipe it up into the forest, and then just release it gently into those patches that we want to have the composition of the air, which is the composition that we'll all be standing around in by about the middle of this century.
Yeah. So it's going to be really interesting to come back and find out how it all pans out and what the research shows. And thank you very much for both of you for having us. It's been really, really interesting to see what's going on and find out more what's happening, and that things, broadly speaking, out here with the science and in the urban environment as well, are all, progressively moving forward, hopefully in the right direction. And, there is a lot of positive change happening, and the fact that there is just so much going on that's hidden away in the woods and all this type of thing that you otherwise wouldn't know about.
No, you're very welcome, Niall. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. And it's been really interesting for me, I must say, I think also for Emma, that to be able to talk to you about that broader part of the Institute, Bifor Institute, how we go from this kind of fundamental science to what can practically be done in the built environment. It makes our lives interesting and exciting, and it's great to talk to you about it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
It is. If you're interested in the Trees and Design Action Group, check out our website.
So we'll put it in the description.
Niall.
We'll put it in the description. Right, cheers, thank you. It's important to remember that sustainability doesn't just relate to the environment, it relates to your finances as well. That's why we switched to Beans accountants. Beans operate on a package system, so you always know where you stand. We halved our accountancy costs when we moved to them, and one of our associates moved to them as well and reduced theirs by 2/3. With free tax advice, accountancy support, and everything else they offer, you can't go wrong. So make sure you check out Beans Accountants in the description below. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you finding out about air really interesting, then maybe you'd like to learn about another element and how that's also being impacted as well, and that's water. We have a fantastic episode with Tapua talking about how we're, well, frankly, running out in the south of England and what we can do about it. And there is a lot we can do, so make sure you check that episode out as well. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to friends and colleagues. And a huge thank you to our sponsor, Beans Accountants, and all our incredibly kind supporters, Gillian Goodson Design, the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and of course, we're powered by ND Landscape Architects and Monsterdon.